about his petition. Is your petition a political petition or a legal petition? And if it's a political petition, which political bodies will hear it? If it's a legal petition, what is the court of jurisdiction?
I do not view it as a political petition. I view it as a legal petition that is prepared to be filed. The jurisdiction would be the Court of Human Rights in Europe, and it would have to be brought by an Acadian residing in Europe. There are many that do reside, and many have offered to act as the plaintiff in the suit, and I've had offers from attorneys who would be willing to handle that petition in Europe. Initially, my position would have been to file it in the World Court, but then I learned that the World Court only has jurisdiction of disputes between and among countries. On the suggestion of some local international lawyers, I could have filed in the state court and taken the position, because the Acadians were treated as though they were a separate legal entity in the Treaty of Paris, and as though they had legal representatives at the negotiations leading to the Treaty of Paris, that would have been sufficient to establish jurisdiction in the World Court. But probably with the information that I gained in my last visit to France and conferring with these international lawyers, that probably the better position would be to bring it in the Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights. Thank you.
Yes.
I have some definite observations I'm going to try to articulate into a question. I hope I'm successful at some point. I can't help but notice as I sit through all of this that we're very diverse in language and in culture. And that diversity has caused oppression, or that diversity has been the excuse used in some cases for oppression. Warren talks about the oppression in the dérangement d'Acadie. We heard the gentleman from France talk about the lack of understanding in Somalia causing injustice. And we hear about the language from the gentleman from Quebec, and we hear the songs about the anti-French movement because it causes oppression. How do we reconcile, gentlemen, the diversity and translate it into an understanding and a common quest for human rights? In other words, are we fighting diversity, or are we trying to continue our diverse culture and seek a new level of understanding? And how do we do that?
I'm going to find lunch. I'm going to try to answer your question in English. Please forgive my mistakes, please. From my point of view is, if we have open-mindedness, and if we forgive and forget that we represent people and act as third parties, it would be a lot easier to answer to your question. So think about all the diversities. Regard them as a judge. And just decide, what can we do with all of that? With open-mindedness. And if we respect everybody, if we don't care about our differences, I think everybody will be happy. But the main target is to be open-minded. And if we're open-minded about anything and everything, we're going to find great solutions. Yes.
Ouellet.
You don't see.
And it relates to what we were just speaking about. Well, first, just to bounce off what was said, I believe that if we could all just accept the paradox that if we can be unique and original and yet all be part of the same culture, you know, and if we could all accept that paradox, we could all get along a lot better. But I wanted to ask you, does the license plate in Quebec still say "Je me souviens"? And I've always wanted to know, what is it that French Canadians remember?
It's a pretty good question. Yeah, the answer is yes. It's still written on the license plate of the car, "Je me souviens." And what it means is we are supposed to remember where we're coming from. And the battle that we had in Quebec City, and it's I think it's rare in the world that a place was discovered, just like Quebec City, and that it lost its identity at the same place. You understand what I mean? In French I would be better, but you know, Champlain founded Quebec City, and Champlain, Montcalm lost in Quebec City. He lost his French Empire and all the French culture with the British invasion. So, yeah, it's still "Je me souviens," and we are supposed to remember where we're coming from. And that is the main topic of our subject when I say that we're losing our French heritage. Maybe we're not remembering anymore.
Yeah, my question is for Mr. Perrin. I see in your speech you spoke of the petition against the British government seeking a declaration ending the Acadian exile. Now, and I understand earlier during your speech you mentioned the reparations that were paid to the Japanese. My question to you is, how do you feel about reparations for African Americans after all this time?
It's a very interesting subject. I have used that as one of the examples. I mentioned only 3 where the seeking of a reconciliation by a people, some that succeeded, some that failed, and some that are underway. And I view the Afro-American situation as one that is underway. I don't think it really has been defeated or succeeded. Certainly, it's difficult to argue against the position that because of the African diaspora, the economic situation of America in general, and the South in particular, was greatly enhanced through the enslavement of those people. Far from my recollection of history, would have been somewhere from 1710 until the end of the Civil War, until the Emancipation Proclamation. Quite a longer period of time than the enslavement of the Acadian people. The physical enslavement of the Acadian people only lasted 7 years, much longer than the African situation. I have tried to educate myself with the Acadian situation, and because I believe it presents a beautifully imperial example of an enslavement of people. For your people, it's a much more complex issue, and I don't pretend to be an expert on the subject. If I would have to choose sides, I would probably say that economic reparations would be in order. That will have to be addressed by Congress. That is an issue that I believe is as complex as any in this particular area. The Japanese-American issue was very easy because you were dealing with a limited number of people in a clear moral situation, not a legal situation. So they're not parallel. There are comparisons between the two, but certainly I would leave you with this thought: you have precedent on your side.
open this up now, begin. Yes.
Monsieur Ouellet, qu'est-ce que vous voyez comme le sort des Acadiens et des autres francophones hors du Québec si jamais le Québec devenait un pays indépendant?
Est-ce que je dois vous dire que j'espérais pas avoir cette question-là? Je pense que si la souveraineté du Québec était déclarée dans un avenir rapproché, il est certain que le gouvernement qui la ferait aussi en sorte de maintenir la situation actuelle et d'améliorer la situation actuelle des Franco-Ontariens et du reste des Franco-Canadiens. Il reste un si. Le si, c'est comment réagirait l'ensemble du Canada à une situation comme celle-là. Est-ce qu'il permettrait aussi qu'une aide soit faite et que le maintien, je crois que oui. Mais encore une fois, c'est la même question que tout à l'heure. Au Canada aussi, on les a, ces différences-là. Hein? Dans certains pays, on dit que les gens sont noirs, que les gens sont blancs. Dans d'autres, on dit qu'ils sont jaunes, d'autres qui sont blancs. Nous, on a du plaisir à dire qu'il y en a qui parlent français, qu'il y en a qui parlent anglais, et pour certains, ça semble une grande difficulté. Je verrai dans l'avenir si oui ou non, et si la compréhension est vraiment impossible entre les deux, et si on considère que cette compréhension est devenue impossible, et que Québec doit se former en pays souverain, j'espère qu'il aura l'amabilité de maintenir le statut et les possibilités et les offres, je crois, qu'il permet à l'heure actuelle aux Franco-Ontariens, aux Français à l'extérieur, aux francophones à l'extérieur du Québec. Pourquoi les exclure? Hein? C'est ce qu'on essaie de ne pas faire.
Monsieur Maître Gueye aimerait répondre au juge Kang sur la question de pluriculturalisme.
Je suis désolé d'avoir à le faire en français, mais j'espère qu'il va traduire éventuellement pour ce qu'il faudrait comprendre. Si je comprends bien, vous avez posé une question sur cette diversité des cultures, cette diversité des situations face à, j'allais dire, une sorte de nécessité à s'entendre, en tout cas à vivre ensemble. Et c'est exact. Ce que je voudrais dire, je vais rapporter ça à la langue, ça va me permettre de résumer. Parce qu'en fait, il faut voir dans la notion de langue, dans le fait de langue même, le fait de parler français, anglais, espagnol ou autre chose, deux choses à mon avis. La langue est d'abord un véhicule culturel. Ensuite, la langue est un moyen de communication. En tant que véhicule culturel, tous les peuples, que ce soit les Acadiens, les Afro-Américains, les Américains ou les autres, tout peuple qui veut avoir une référence à sa culture d'origine doit absolument lutter pour conserver sa langue d'origine. Sans langue, une culture disparaît. Donc ça, pour la diversité, il est essentiel, parce que les cultures sont différentes dans ce monde. La diversité des cultures est nécessaire pour l'enrichissement de notre monde. Donc pour cela, la langue de chacun doit être préservée. En tout cas, chacun doit tendre pour lutter, pour garder sa spécificité culturelle, à développer sa langue d'origine. Par ailleurs, la langue est un moyen de communication. Et c'est un moyen de communication nécessaire dans un monde qui devient, en tout cas qui tend à devenir de plus en plus un. C'est-à-dire que depuis, par exemple, je cite ça, la chute du communisme, on ne parle plus de monde bipolaire. On parle d'un seul monde dominé par l'économie de marché. Les préoccupations ne sont pas les mêmes, parce que la situation que je viens de vous présenter tout à l'heure n'est pas celle que vous a présentée Warren, ni celle que vous a présentée Jean, même si ça se situe dans le même contexte de dénonciation des violations des droits de l'homme. Ce monde est donc un et on a besoin de communiquer. Il faut absolument, on le reconnaît, qu'il y ait des langues, j'allais dire dominantes, que ce soit, je ne prends pas position, mais des langues qui permettent aux gens de se parler, de se comprendre, bref, d'échanger à tous les niveaux. Je pense donc qu'il faut une diversité d'une part pour garder les spécificités culturelles, et un moyen de communication, en tout cas des moyens de communication universels. Malheureusement, on ne pourrait pas utiliser l'ensemble des langues existantes dans ce monde pour communiquer, sinon on ne se comprendrait plus et la situation deviendrait pire que ce que je viens de dénoncer pour ma part en ce qui concerne la Somalie et l'Afrique. Ça me permet d'enchaîner juste pour dire 2 mots de réponse. Je voudrais bien traduire à Monsieur le Président de l'association qui demandait tout à l'heure à Warren, est-ce que, si je comprends bien, les Afro-Américains avaient aussi le droit à espérer cette sorte de demande de pardon de la part de ceux qui les ont brimés. Ça me touche, vous comprenez bien, au premier chef. Je suis africain, je n'ai pas été déporté, mais comprenez que la situation que je viens de décrire tout à l'heure, la situation dans laquelle vit l'Afrique aujourd'hui, découle de ce que, une petite parenthèse, j'ai vu un film ce matin avec Warren sur les Acadiens où on disait que plus de 10 000 Acadiens ont été exilés. Moi, je vais vous dire, mesdames et messieurs, que c'est plus de 20 millions d'Africains qui ont été vendus hors de leur continent. Et c'était les forces vives de l'Afrique. C'était les forces qui pouvaient permettre à l'Afrique de se développer. C'est donc aussi que il y a une part de responsabilité essentielle qui incombe à la traite négrière. Seulement, il ne faut pas être passéiste. Il faut vivre avec son temps. C'est pourquoi les préoccupations des Afro-Américains aujourd'hui ne sont pas réellement nos préoccupations en Afrique. Les préoccupations des Acadiens ne sont pas réellement nos préoccupations. Pourquoi? Parce qu'ils vivent dans des pays développés. Ils ont au moins de quoi manger. Ils peuvent réclamer autre chose. Les Acadiens ont leur indépendance économique, ont leur pouvoir économique, ils peuvent réclamer autre chose. Mais les Africains, comme je le disais tout à l'heure, avant de réclamer quoi que ce soit, ils veulent d'abord manger. La liberté de parole, ils n'en ont rien à faire s'ils ont faim. Ils veulent être en bonne santé. S'ils sont malades, ils ne vont pas réclamer que quelqu'un leur demande pardon ou pas. Pour le moment, ce n'est pas d'actualité en ce qui concerne l'Africain. L'essentiel, c'est d'assurer le minimum vital.
As he was saying, he takes it all with the cultural linguistic approach, saying that the language is very important because it's basically 2 functions. One is the function of being the vehicle of the culture, and when that dies, usually the culture will die. But it is evident that being a way of communication, you have to think of language as one way to break some barriers. And as we know, since the communist regimes around the world kind of crumble, we have a global economy, meaning that right now we're working into some kind of unilingual, or we're heading towards a kind of universal language. But when it comes to the question of is litigation one way to repair the situation of the Afro-American, it would be interesting to see maybe in the US, but being from Africa himself, he looks at the size of the deportation of the Acadians, which were about 10,000, and then he thinks of the 20 million Africans that were taken from their homes in the negritude in that diaspora, and being that these people were probably the labor force that could have brought Africa to a greater economic development than it is right now, it is hard for him to go for that quest of trying to let's say, sue any form of government outside, because the real problem right now in Africa is more into the need of social justice as feeding the primary needs, housing, feeding, basically the problems of the developed world, like the US, the Afro-American, it's very different. It's a very different experience right now than what's happening in Africa, unfortunately.
Additional questions, yes.
as we talk about the diversity, I think there's one common ground among all three of you. You all are advocates for rights and human rights. And I think a lot of us live each day with people's rights being violated around us and not realizing. You as advocates of human rights, what are the most important virtues of someone who is advocating for human rights, whether it's for the Acadians, the Africans, or the language in Canada?
I didn't start out to be a human rights activist. I backed into this studying the Acadian exile. And going to my first human rights conference and meeting people like Jean, like Diobe, and people like Minodoro from Romania, who wish she could be with us tonight, but they have such a serious situation there that she couldn't leave her country. People from Belgium and people from Luxembourg. I think the common thread was basic love of humanity. I mean, it sounds so trite, but that's the common theme. These were the people that I found at these conferences. Not lawyers looking for a name, not lawyers handling cases where there's money involved, but lawyers handling situations like filing a lawsuit against the World Health Agency to ensure that victims of AIDS throughout the world were provided basic health relief. There's no money in that. So I think it's just a basic concern for fellow human beings.
Oui, si je comprends bien la question, c'est qu'est-ce qu'il faudrait pour être militant des droits de l'homme, en tout cas lutter pour les droits de l'homme. Simplement être humain. Comprendre que les droits de l'homme n'ont qu'une seule finalité, le bien de l'être humain. Être humain et savoir transmettre son humanité.
Yes.
The translation is to be human and to be able to transcend that being as humanity and humans. And I'm not sure if the word humanist is a legal word, but it's a transcending.
Bien, ma question s'adresse à Maître Diobe Gueye et j'ai été particulièrement sensible, évidemment, étant français et un de ses confrères, à son intervention. Ceci étant, la notion d'ingérence humanitaire, qui est une notion internationale nouvelle, ne porte-t-elle pas en elle des dangers, des risques? Car qui peut se reconnaître le droit de dire si un pays, qui est souverain, chaque pays l'est, vous le savez, a bien fait ou mal fait vis-à-vis de son peuple, et jusqu'où, justement, cette ingérence humanitaire peut-elle aller, par qui doit-elle être contrôlée? Est-ce que dans vos moyens d'action, parce que vous nous avez dit qu'on payait tous des impôts, je pense que aussi bien aux États-Unis qu'en France, on le sait, que trop. Bien sûr, il y a le bulletin de vote, mais est-ce que vous reconnaissez à des instances internationales la possibilité d'avoir une ingérence qui va au-delà de l'humanitaire? Parce que l'humanitaire n'est pas suffisant, je parle et je pense, et vous pensez avec moi, peut-être à une ingérence politique. Mais là, c'est là qu'il y a le danger. Jusqu'où va et peut aller l'ingérence humanitaire, c'est ma question.
D'accord. Quand on dit ingérence, on pense forcément à l'aspect politique, d'où danger. Seulement, mon cher confrère, il y a déjà jurisprudence. Je n'invente rien, je n'appelle à rien de nouveau. Quand la communauté internationale, parce qu'elle ne pouvait plus supporter ce qui se passait en Somalie, a décidé d'agir et d'intervenir militairement en Somalie, c'était fondé sur quoi? Sur une simple résolution des Nations Unies. Donc ce n'est pas moi aujourd'hui qui vais apprendre à la communauté internationale comment faire pour agir et stopper telle ou telle situation. Et encore, moi je dis que cette ingérence humanitaire, cet devoir d'ingérence, il faut lui donner son sens économique. On n'a même pas besoin de cet aspect politique. C'est simplement économique dans la mesure où l'on sait, quand je parle de ce que les dirigeants de ces pays où les peuples sont en train de mourir de faim et d'autres choses, quand on sait que ce que les dirigeants ont fait a été au vu des dirigeants des pays occidentaux, quand on sait que c'est M. Bérégovoy, feu M. Bérégovoy, Premier ministre de la France, qui disait que la France, ses services, à l'époque il était ministre de l'économie et des finances, connaissent combien d'argent a chaque dirigeant africain, où est caché cet argent et d'où vient cet argent. Et quand on sait que d'où vient cet argent, par exemple la France, par la caisse centrale de coopération ou le trésor, donne de l'argent à tel pays. On sait que cet argent ne quitte jamais la France. C'est pareil pour l'Amérique ou le Fonds monétaire international. On donne de l'argent, cet argent ne quitte jamais l'Occident, il va directement dormir dans un compte. Moi je dis qu'on n'a pas besoin d'aller chercher de midi à 14h, en tout cas de rentrer dans un système qui nous mette en porte-à-faux avec ce danger politique dont vous faisiez référence tout à l'heure pour réparer. Il suffit, mais vraiment il suffit que le trésor public, d'une décision politique, et je ne veux pas être long, mais il y a un exemple très récent qui me permet de le dire. Vous savez que entre septembre 1993 et décembre 1993, près de 5 milliards de francs français ont été détournés par les dirigeants des pays de l'Afrique de l'Ouest qui ont le franc CFA pour aller le cacher en Suisse. Pourquoi? Parce qu'ils savaient que le franc CFA allait dévaluer. Alors, ils prennent cet argent, ils l'amènent en liquide en Suisse, ils le transforment en dollars, en marques, en tout cas en monnaie forte, et le mettent dans des comptes numérotés. Le trésor public français est obligé de racheter cette monnaie pour ne pas, en tout cas pour permettre à sa propre monnaie de ne pas en souffrir. Alors quand il a fallu qu'on arrête tout ça, qu'est-ce qu'on a fait? La France, certainement l'Amérique informée, mais la France essentiellement, le Fonds monétaire international et la Banque mondiale ont décidé, péremptoirement, sans demander l'avis à personne, péremptoirement ont décidé de dévaluer le franc français de moitié. Voilà une décision courageuse. Dans quel intérêt? Je ne me prononce pas. Mais aujourd'hui, j'en appelle à des décisions qui vont dans le sens de l'intérêt de ces peuples-là. Et on ne demande rien à personne. Nous sommes en train de payer les intérêts de dette dont on n'a jamais vu la couleur. On est simplement en train de demander qu'on cesse désormais de soutenir ces régimes fantoches. Ce qu'on pouvait comprendre tant que le monde était bipolaire, il ne l'est plus. Il n'y a plus d'intérêt aujourd'hui pour l'Occident de soutenir ces régimes. On demande simplement qu'on leur dise, écoutez, arrêtez, ça suffit. Cet argent, on le rapatrie, ce n'est pas pour vous, c'est pour vos peuples. Et je ne doute pas un seul instant que la chose est facile. Seulement, les gouvernants peut-être, ici, n'y ont pas intérêt. Le jour où ils y trouveront un intérêt, ne serait-ce que électoral, c'est pourquoi j'en appelais à l'opinion publique occidentale, c'est pourquoi je parlais de votre vote. Le jour où ils sauront que vous, opinion publique, vous, votants occidentaux, vous le réclamez, ils le feront. Je ne veux pas être plus long.
Oh, yeah. The question was asked about humanitarian insurance, about humanitarian help that some countries do to other countries, like in the case of Somalia, and it was specifically asked if that was not dangerous because every sovereign country has its own procedures, people pay taxes in those countries, and they have the right to vote, basically. So the answer is maybe, but we all know what's happened in Africa, and the fact that some money never went from the Fonds Monétaire, that monetary fund, International Monetary Fund, to Africa, that they were diverted to Switzerland and transferred in some other currencies, is probably an example exactly of people shutting their eyes, either the government of France or the government of the US, knew that these people were speculating on the franc, that special franc that's established in Africa, and which was devaluated 50% overnight a couple of months ago. this causing some harm to the economy, that's for sure, but at the same time protecting these rich people that everybody knows never send the money to their own country, and they just divert it. So it's money laundering in a new fashion. And,
Sure. Just 30 seconds. First of all, thank you for your questions. I did that many times, and questions are rare in those situations, so thank you. I thought about your question. I thought about my answer. I'm not a human rights activist. I've been practicing law. I started pretty young and been practicing law for now 5 years approximately. And you know, I do labor law, and I represent employers, not employee. Never represented an employee in my life. Represent employers, the big bad ones. But yeah, international companies firing thousands of people. There's a law that is applicable in every country in the world, and that should be. And that's, in my head, the first quality you must have. It's what we call in French, la loi du bon sens, common sense. If you follow that in your everyday activities, you'll always be right. And something you should never forget, I think, is that you always have people screaming on one side or on the other. But you always have the silent majority. And the law that is guiding the silent majority is common sense. That's where you should go.
One final question? Yes?
Yes, I'd like to direct a question to Mr. Perrin. I sometime hear, or I think all of us in this room have witnessed over indulgence in the ethnic cleansing and what's going on with the French language, the language cleansing. And what I was interested in is, you mentioned, I heard somewhere in the history of the Acadians' exile that they were gathered together by the Spanish when the Spanish ceded the French government in Louisiana, and the Spanish assisted the Acadians in getting themselves together and settled in Lafayette and other places around the state. What I'm trying to determine is, are there any efforts that are residual to what you are doing that would commemorate some of the positive things through cross-cultural relations, such as what the Spanish did that was actually positive for the Acadians? And you know, since you had mentioned something about a memorial for, yes.
Yeah, it's a good question. The Spanish really don't get enough credit for what they did, not only for the Acadians, but for many other peoples at that time. During that period of time, Louisiana, New Orleans in particular, had really become a deplorable place. We can give Spain a lot of credit, but we must keep in perspective they did it for an economic reason. They needed good settlers, and they knew what had happened to the Acadians. They knew that the inaction by the French and the English really created a deplorable situation. There aren't many heroes in the Acadian exile on any side. The Spanish representatives reimbursed the French government for the expenses that the Acadians incurred while they were in poverty in their country, and literally bought them for the reimbursement of their upkeep while they had been returned to France and before they were brought to Louisiana. And so many of these Acadians wanted to come that the French government had to put a stop to it after 7 voyages, because there was a great fear that this could have triggered a mass migration of not only Acadians but so-called Frenchmen into Louisiana. But the Spanish really had a very enlightened government at that time. The Spanish government, the laws, really formed the root of our civil laws, as I'm sure the attorneys in the room realize that the laws of Louisiana are not rooted only in the Napoleonic Code or the Code Civil, but also many of our civil laws and our very good enlightened laws dealing with relations between people and fairness and equality go back to that Spanish regime, which wasn't very long in New Orleans, which was only from 1767 till about 1800. But it really transformed that society. And to answer your question directly, I really don't know any commemorative other than all streets in the French Quarter have a Spanish and a French name.
I would like to now introduce Dr. Pat Rickles, Professor of English and Director of the University's Honors Program, for concluding remarks. Dr. Rickles.
We have enjoyed such a very informative, enlightening, thought-provoking afternoon. And my ears have been straining to try to understand more than one kind of French. And I'm not too good at it, but I got a little bit better during the afternoon, and I bet some of you did too. I'm here to thank Mr. Ernest Gaines, my friend and colleague, who I thought read such an appropriate selection to begin the conference. And to thank the musicians, Joe DeZormo and Jimmy Felix, for their very interesting and meaningful songs. And especially to thank our three panelists for their presentations. And I would like to give them each a small gift on behalf of the conference. Mr. Warren Perrin. Warren, this is a small token of appreciation. I hope you enjoy it. And inside it, there is a very special thing. Look in and see.
Thank you.
He's got his very own copy, Ernie, of A Lesson Before Dying.
Don't leave before you autograph it.
Yeah. Ernie, we have a gift for you too. We thought you had gone. Please come down. We thought he had left. And Mr. Diobe Gueye. Sorry, I can't say it better. I really enjoyed what you said, and I would like to go to Senegal and see the place that gave birth to a man like you. And Mr. Jean Ouellet. I didn't get to ask my question. May I ask? In Louisiana, I think some part of the French language has been saved among the young people because it is the vehicle for a lot of their music, folk music and popular music. Are you so fortunate as to have something like this in Quebec?
It's unfortunate that we need laws to oblige our radio station to put some French music, to play some French music, because if not, we have cultural music, folk music, but the funny thing about it is that we listen to it in festival and never in the day-to-day life.
Too bad. Well, we did it without laws. We just did it because we had the spirit. Mr. King? And here's a gift for our famous writer-in-residence, Ernie Gueye. Thank you. And I'm just about finished. I have one more thing I'd like to say. It's not original, but I'm a folklorist, and I prize more those things that are passed on, and this is something I heard, and I want to repeat it. Two elderly Cajun men were talking, Mr. Babineau and Mr. Theriault. They were talking about Warren Perrin's petition. And Mr. Babineau said, you know, it was a terrible thing the English did. Le grand dérogement, it was a great injustice, and Mr. Perrin is right to make this petition. And Mr. Theriault said, well, yeah, But on the other hand, I'm glad it happened. It turned out well. He said, what do you mean? He said, look, if not for that, we'd have been a bunch of English Protestants, and Louisiana would be nothing.
By way of coda, 2 points before we close. The questions were intricate and profound. The first question suggested that when two groups of people are put together in a single space, or if more than two groups of people are put together in a single space, that history teaches us that while all people are brothers, our favorite sport is fratricide. And that the human spirit has not conquered and learned to live together. We have great hope. The question was, through what basis can we join? We suggested our common humanity. I might suggest another alternative. It's a common creed, a common idea. I'm reminded of Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech of 1963, that momentous occasion. He held a mirror to the American public, and he said, we can all join together, we are all one people, is not the logo, as it were, of the country, e pluribus unum, out of many one. That e pluribus unum was originally designed to identify several separate sovereign states joined together, the states being the many and the one being the nation. States are no longer the issue. The issue is the diversity of our people. That's where the many is. Can that many become a one? And indeed, he suggested that many can become a one if we share a common belief. What he called in that speech of 1963, the American Creed. And he said that American Creed is there before us. Why don't we grasp the obvious? It's in the great state documents, it's in the Declaration of Independence, it's in the Gettysburg Address. We hold all men to be created equal. And by men, we all know he meant humankind. And that is the creed. I don't think it's an accident that in that horrible summer of 1989, Chinese students at Tiananmen Square put up the Statue of Liberty. It wasn't a white woman they were celebrating. It was a creed of all people being created equal. And I think in that creed, if all of humanity can share that belief in human rights, nothing less than 17th and 18th century philosophical thought, that we may all have a chance and we may all be able to beat the fratricide that haunts the world. Still, as we read the papers this morning and look at the nightmare of the Middle East, and look at the nightmare of parts of Africa, and look at the nightmare of Eastern Europe, and those are only the prominent, notable examples visible in the public media. I think we shall prevail. I think we'll prevail because there are great writers, and there are great poets, and there are great musicians, and there are great intellectuals, and with a single voice, they talk about human rights. Thank you for attending this first Human Rights Conference sponsored by Festival International and the University of Southwestern Louisiana. Thank you very much for being here.